Hi, thanks for taking the time to listen to my presentation. My name is Johanna and I'm going to be talking you through my system sense. I'm in the final year of my degree studying computer science and mathematics, and the idea that I'm going to be presenting to you today was my final year project idea. Before I go into the details of the system, I'll give you a bit of background into the problems that my system addresses. As an aspiring secondary school teacher, I have a lot of work experience in schools, particularly in the area of Nottinghamshire. With Nottinghamshire having such a diverse culture, it is very representative of the statistic that 1 in 5 students comes from abroad. With a lot of these students coming from Black, Asian and minority ethnic families, language barriers can be an issue. And because the students are coming into school every single day, the rate of development of their English is much quicker than that of their families. Students are regularly assessed throughout the academic year, and this information is given to parents or guardians mainly through two methods. One method is Parents' Evening, where the parents and guardians have the opportunity to come into school and meet with their child's teacher face to face, and the second option is through school reports. School reports in the UK are a legal requirement, and they're sent out either annually or biannually from the school to the student's home. These reports will detail students' academic achievements, their attendance record, and it will contain a written comment from their teacher detailing their attitude towards that subject. It is so important that for a student to progress in their educational journey, not only do they need support from their teachers, but they also need support from their parents and guardians at home. However, if you're sending home one of these reports to parents and guardians, and you have a big paragraph of English text, and they don't necessarily understand it, can they be involved in their child's education? Are they fully informed of what their child needs to do to improve, and are they therefore able to help? Probably not. If 1 in 5 students are coming from abroad, and therefore not all of these families can speak English, the problem that I want to solve is how can we convey the progress of a student to their parents and guardians who don't necessarily speak English? So that was the first issue that had arisen that I wanted to find a solution for. However, there is a second problem that needs solving, and it's from COVID-19. At the time of filming this, the UK is currently in lockdown from the COVID-19 pandemic, and one of the impacts of this is that students are currently not able to go to school. Particularly, this includes GCSE and A-level students who unfortunately are unable to sit their exams. Teachers have been faced with an extremely difficult job of having to predict the student grades using a combination of any test scores they've had, the attitude towards their lesson, any homework marks, and collect all of this together and attempt to identify how well the student would have performed should they have sat their exam. So with thousands and thousands of teachers having to predict student grades, are we certain that there isn't any bias going on? With so many to do, are they putting in the same amount of effort? But more importantly, can we be certain that on a national scale, every student is being fairly and equally assessed? What if there was an automated way of assessing a student's progress? You could churn out multiple in one go, there's not going to be any bias, the computer's not going to tire, and more importantly, on a national scale, if everybody is using the same system, then the predicted grades that are generated will be consistent. So with those two issues identified, there is definitely a purpose for a computerized system, there is a gap in the market, and that is where I created my system, Sense. This system uses the 3 main factors that contribute towards a student's academic performance, that is their attainment, their attendance, and their attitude. And it contains several functionalities to aid a teacher in analysing a student's academic performance. Student test scores can be input into the system and represented in a graphical format, and the same applies with the student attendance figures too. However, the main focus of the system is to review a student's attitude towards their learning. Like I mentioned earlier, the schools send home academic reports to parents and guardians regarding that student's progress, but if the family is a BAME family, there's no guarantee that they're going to understand the paragraph of text written in English from the teacher. Although schools are encouraged to write reports in the family's home language, that's not always a guarantee and it's not always possible. So in order for these families to understand what's been written and keep them in the loop of their child's progress, my solution? We take this qualitative data of the teacher's written comment and turn it into quantitative data by means of Arabic numerals, and we do this through a process called sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis is a form of natural language processing where computers are trained to understand words or phrases in a text excerpt. When analysing this text excerpt, The computer will pick out the bits of information and determine whether it is positive, neutral, or negative. For example, the sentence, "The talk was very informative, but not that interesting," has a lot in it for a computer to interpret and understand. The word very is used to emphasise whatever term comes after it, and therefore boost that polarity score, either in a positive or a negative way, depending on the sentence and the context. But signifies that there's going to be an alternative viewpoint presented, whereas not reverses the opinion that's about to follow from either positive to negative or vice versa. And of course we have words like informative and interesting, which themselves are assigned positive polarity scores. The computing will use its understanding of any of the presented terms and combine everything to give an overall polarity score. As sentiment analysis has the ability to understand the human language, it was the perfect tool to aid in the solution to my problem and why it is the key feature of my system sense. I've chosen to use a Python tool called Vader, which was the perfect fit for my proposed system. Vader will be used to assess any teacher's written comments on students and perform the sentiment analysis to assign that text excerpt with an overall polarity score. This polarity score will be turned into a percentage and combined with the student's attainment and attendance scores to give the student an overall performance score. These performance scores can be included on student reports for the benefit of BAME families and can act as a reflection on a student's academic achievements as they transition between different year groups and different schools in their educational journey. It also acts as a consistent method of assessing a student's progress, which can be used to predict their grades. As it takes into account different factors that contribute towards a student's progress, it would be extremely beneficial in a situation like this COVID-19 pandemic when teachers are in need of assessing how well a student has performed throughout the year. So now, with the details of the system explained, allow me to give you a demo of my system Sense. Sense is a student performance quantifier using sentiment analysis. When Sense is booted up, it will present you with a main menu screen, with the first option being to graph all of the students' attendances. The system will read in the attendance figures for a particular class, including their names. The teacher will then have the option to input whatever name they want for the graph. The graph is then generated using the students' attendance figures and their names, and it's displayed in a web browser. This acts as a great way for the teacher to identify any trends that may present in the attendance figures. The second option is to graph the individual test scores. Similarly, it reads from a spreadsheet, it brings in all of the student test scores. Again, you have the option to name the graph. Once again, data is read in from a spreadsheet for one particular student, with their name going on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have a line graph of all of their test scores. Again, this is displayed in a web browser and acts as a good method of comparison for a teacher to spot any trends in the student test scores. Menu option number 3 is very similar to number 1. Instead of graphing a class's attendance figures, it will graph a class's test scores. Similarly to option number 1, you input the graph name, you have the students along the x-axis, and you have their test scores along the y-axis. Again, it's a good tool for teachers to use to be able to spot any trends in the data. Menu option number 4 implements the main functionality of my system, and that is the sentiment analysis. To perform the sentiment analysis, the system reads in the text excerpt and analyses each sentence one at a time. Each sentence will be assigned its own polarity score and will be averaged to give the student an overall attitude score. These attitude scores are combined with their attendance and aptitude scores to give the student an overall performance score. These overall performance scores with the student's name are saved in a dictionary format to a text file and can be referred to later on. The final option, menu option number 5, is very similar to option number 1 and option number 3. The user is asked to input the name of the text file, which contains any performance scores with the students' names that they want to graph. Again, enter the graph name, put the students on the x-axis, their overall performance scores on the y-axis, and generate a graph which opens in a browser window to identify any trends. Now that I've given you a quick demo into my system Sense, I'll go through some of the results, the testing procedures, and what I discovered from my findings. For testing, 188 text excerpts were extracted from real school reports from 10 different participants, and each of these 188 student profiles were also assigned an attendance figure and an aptitude figure. These attendance and aptitude scores were assigned in order to reflect the different circumstances that could be encountered throughout different students in an academic environment. The 3 graphs that are currently displayed on the screen were used only for testing purposes, and they show the correlation between each of the 3 factors and how they affected the overall performance score that was generated by the system. It's pleasing to see that all 3 graphs show a strong positive correlation, as it signifies the strong impact that it had on the performance score. The graph that shows the attendance score against the overall performance score did have the lowest correlation. However, that is to be expected. By law, students are required to attend school, so these attendance figures are presenting of upwards of 90% and higher, with a few that is dropping a little bit below, but there isn't too much variation. When analysing the polarity scores that were assigned to each of the 188 different student profiles, I believe that the vast majority of them were a fair reflection on the students' performance. However, I do believe there were some polarity scores that did not fairly represent a student's attitude towards their learning, but that can be improved in the future with further customisation of how the computer interprets certain lexicon and by using more test data to build a bigger picture. On the whole, this project for me was far more successful than I could have anticipated, and it definitely exceeded my expectations. There are 2 main problems that my system aimed to tackle, one of which was including BAME families fairly in their child's progress. This was done by means of a percentage, and I believe this was a really successful outcome. And the second was to create a centralised system where a student's academic progress could be reviewed, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic and with teachers having to predict student grades, I believe a system in these circumstances like this would have been perfect. I think this system is a great foundation for introducing these concepts of machine learning into a school environment and to introduce new technologies that perhaps aren't already existing in a school. I think if these concepts are to be introduced into schools, I think the system does need a lot more development, and I think there's still quite a way to go with this. Like I addressed earlier, I think this application could still be more accurate, and I don't think all of the polarity scores were a fair reflection on all students and their academic progress. On the whole, I think sentiment analysis still has quite a way to go. There are still a lot of sentences and ideas and concepts that computers are yet to understand, and machine learning still has quite a way to go in terms of training computers to understand human languages. However, as this form of machine learning continues to develop and improve, my system can definitely be altered and adapted to reflect these positive changes. Despite most teacher comments being typed, I think it would be nice to take sense one step further and to implement optical character recognition, so any handwritten comments could also be analysed by the computer. I think this project, more than anything, has provided a great talking point into how we assess students in schools and what different methods are available. I think parents' evenings are great. I think school reports are a fantastic way of conveying a student's progress and a summary of their educational journey throughout the whole academic year. But I think there is still work to be done to making sure that all families are included. As well as the COVID-19 pandemic raising the question of how do we fairly assess students, I think it's also introduced the need for modern technology and how this can be implemented in our schools and keep schools in line with modern businesses. ICT permeates most aspects of life, and it would be perverse to exclude it from education. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my presentation. If there are any questions or you'd like to have a discussion about any of the points that I've raised, my ORC ID is on the screen. Please do get in contact and I'd be delighted to reply to your message. Thanks again, and I hope you can see the sense in my system.